good evening everyone. Last week we had our lecture on the arm, upper arm and forearm. We grouped the muscles of the forearm into the major groups of flexor and extensor. And this week we're going to move a little more distal down the arm, and we're going to talk about how those flexor and extensor muscles are going to be visible around the wrist and the hand area. And this is going to appear as subtle tendons that are going to add a nice amount of angularity and shape to a hand and to a wrist. One of the common mistakes we see in student work is that hands appear too rounded, too squishy. Fingers, instead of having the angularity that they require, end up looking like sausages. There's not enough shape of the forearm flowing into the wrist, flowing into the hand. So we're going to talk about the bones that we're going to see and the tendons that we're going to see, in hopes that as we start to inspect the hand and render it out, we do so with a little more sensitivity and capture all the unique, subtle nature that is inherent in all hands. So first we'll take a look at some of the bones. The bones are relatively simple. When we get to the muscles, you can see that a lot of muscles or tendons that we're going to look at today. So this is the day where it can start to get confusing, and we're going to have to make sure we study, maybe even label your arm, do flashcards, rewatch this video as many times as needed. Make sure you do the anatomy drawings before next week, because next week we have our midterm. So first of all, bones. Let's take a look at the bones. We have a pisiform and underneath that triquetrum. Those are both referring to bones that we're going to see on the wrist here. The pisiform is listed in Bridgman, and I think Vanderpool talks about it also. And the pisiform is the bony projection on the distal end of the ulna. And this is the, it's a bone in and of itself. It's not the ulna. The ulna is back here. But it's a bone in the wrist that is placed on the palmar side. And if you lay your hand, or rest your hand and arm on a table, the pisiform is the bone that will make contact with the surface. So when we're drawing or painting a figure and their hand is angled in just the right position, you will be able to see the bony projection of the pisiform. So we do need to make sure we render that, because we'll see this gentle sloping that'll hit this angularity, this bony landmark of the pisiform, and then it'll go into the squishy nature of the muscles in the hand. So make sure we hit the pisiform. It's going to be a palmar side, distal end of the arm on the ulna side, or the little pinky side of the hand. Now, the triquetrum is sort of its sister bone. It's situated almost directly on top of the pisiform. It's this guy here. Now, we talked about last week the ulna. The ulna is this big bony projection at the distal end of the arm here, on the little finger side. And then just beyond that is another little bone that pops out in most people that we'll be able to see. And this second bone is the triquetrum. So we're going to see some interesting forms here. We're going to see the arm dissipate into the ulna here, where we'll see the bone of the ulna, then we'll see another little bump indicating the triquetrum, and then we'll see another squishy pad here, a group of muscle on this side of the hand here. So we need to make sure we indicate both, because we have the again, the ulna, the triquetrum just distal to the ulna, and then on the palmar side, the pisiform. So that takes care of our first couple bones. Next we have the metacarpal and the phalange. So the metacarpal and phalange are the bones of the fingers. Now, if we look at our skeleton here, this is the wrist, and on this wrist we see a large cluster of bones, most of which you cannot see superficially. We talked about the pisiform, which is right here, a little bone that the hand sits on, and then the triquetrum, which is on top here, and just distal to the ulna. And then you don't have to know any other wrist bones, but we do need to know the bones of the finger. Now, just beyond the wrist, we have the bone called the metacarpal, which makes perfect sense when we consider the Latin. Meta means beyond, carpal is Latin for wrist. So the literal translation of this these set of bones, there's 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Metacarpal is beyond the wrist. So they're the bones that are directly beyond the wrist, and we can't see them. When we look at our hand, thusly, the metacarpals are all housed inside the palm. The squishiness here, we have bones and tendons covering the top and bottom, housing and protecting and supplying leverage to our metacarpals here. Now, beyond the metacarpals, we have what are called phalanges, literally translated to soldiers. And the phalanges are the fingers. You'll notice that each finger has 3 segments, 3 phalanges to it. The thumb has 2. So the thumb has the metacarpal, and then a phalange segment, and a phalange segment. Every other finger has the metacarpal, and a phalange segment, a phalange segment, and a phalange segment. So we need to make sure that each of our fingers is not just a long tubey sausage, but actually has 3 noticeable segments. And towards the end of this lecture, we're going to talk about how the pads of the finger line up underneath the bony meeting place of each segment as well. To recap, we have bony projection of the ulna, and then we have just distal to that, we have the triquetrum. Sitting directly underneath on the palmar side of the triquetrum is the pisiform. Then we have 5 metacarpals, and then we have 3 phalanges on each finger, and 2 phalanges on the thumb. Those are all the bones that we need to keep in mind. So it should be relatively straightforward. Next, let's talk about some of the muscles and the tendons. You can see on the board here we have them arranged via the side. So we have the dorsal side and the palmar side. So we're going to look for a set of tendons appearing on the dorsal side, or the back side of the hand, and then a set on the palmar side, the palm side of the hand. So first, let's break down a little bit of the Latin so we understand what we're talking about with each one, and that'll greatly simplify the complexity that each of these is. For example, extensor carpi ulnaris. It sounds complicated until you understand what each of those things mean, and then we know exactly where to look and exactly what to look for. And hopefully, as we cover each one of these, you'll know specifically the shape or target area of that specific muscle or tendon that we're looking at. So first of all, extensor. Extensor, you'll notice, underneath the dorsal side, all lined up are extensors. Underneath the palmar side, all lined up are flexors. So extensor flexor is going to tell you whether or not we're dealing with the dorsal side or the palmar side of the hand. Keep in mind, when we extend fingers, they go out, meaning the muscle and associated tendon have to be on the dorsal side, the top side of the hand, because the muscle flexes here, or contracts here, it pulls the tendons, and then as the tendons on top are pulled, like a marionette puppet, our fingers extend. The opposing action to that, if we look at the palmar side, the flexor muscles are all set inside the forearm, remember we talked about last week. So as this muscle contracts, then it pulls the tendons down here, and our fingers and our wrist flex inward. So it should be relatively simple. You know, if we mention flexor, we're talking about something on the palmar side of the hand. If we're mentioning an extensor, we're talking about something on the dorsal side of the hand. So when you have the test, for example, and it says to label the prominent tendons, and you see a few tendons on the dorsal side of the hand, it is likely that the very first word in that labeling will include extensor. Keep in mind that for many of these things we're talking about, there will be an extensor and a flexor for each of them. So if you leave out the extensor or the flexor, you're not appropriately labeling the muscle or the tendon. So let's go ahead and run down the dorsal side. Extensor means that it's extending, and it's therefore on the back side. Carpi. Carpi is a common word, or Latin word for wrist. So whenever you hear or read any description containing carpi, or for example carpal tunnel syndrome, has to do with the wrist. So that should be relatively straightforward. Anything carpi has to do with the wrist, so we're looking target area for the wrist. It's affecting some motion of the wrist. Coming down here we have a digitorum and digiti, or digiti as some people pronounce it. These are both referring to the digits. So the digits meaning the fingers. So the extensor, or the tendons here, are affecting some action of the fingers. So it should make a little sense there. And then down here, this next one, pollicis. Pollicis is referring to the thumb. So, we took a trip to the museum. We saw that famous Jerome painting, Pollicio Verso. It's referring to, or it translates to thumbs down. It's it's the gladiator painting where one gladiator has his foot on another gladiator, sword pointed down, and then he's looking up to the Caesar, and the Caesar has Pollicio Verso, thumbs down. So pollicio, or pollicis in this case, is referring to a thumb. So right away that's going to start to clarify something, or a lot of information here. Extensor, meaning these things are extended. Carpi, it's telling you that the wrist is extended. Digiti means the digits are extended. Pollicis, it means the thumb is extended. It should be very straightforward, logical, the way these things are named. You shouldn't have to really rack your brain to memorize each of these if we understand some of the common root words. So again, extensor, carpi, ulnaris. Extensor means the wrist is extended in some way, so up or up and to the side in this case. Ulnaris indicates which side of the wrist we're talking about. So extensor means it's the dorsal side, carpi, it's the wrist, ulnaris is indicating it's on the ulna side of the wrist. So quite literally, it's this tendon originating in the extensor group, the tendon that's running along here and going across the distal end of the ulna. So this is the tendon we're searching for. It's this rigid line is where we'll see it when our wrist is extended. A rigid line that runs down and feeds into the ulna, or feeds over the ulna. We'll see when that wrist is extended, like this, and we'll see it on the ulna side of the wrist. Running down the list, extensor digitorum communis. So extensor, meaning it's on the dorsal side of the wrist. Digitorum, it's extending the fingers. Communis is referring to community. So it's extending a community of fingers. So we have the extensor muscle located here. And when we're extending the fingers, straightening them out, you'll notice the tendons here. A tendon ridge here, a tendon ridge here, and a tendon ridge here. There's actually 3 of them. So it's going to your pointer, your middle, and your ring finger. Those are the 3 tendons that it's affecting. It originates with one muscle here in the arm, and then it feeds down, and we have the 3 tendons that are feeding into the fingers. Extensor, it's on the top side, and it's extending the fingers. Digitorum, fingers, and then communis, it's the 3 fingers. Extensor, digitorum, communis. Next one down here, we have extensor digiti, or digiti minimi, or minimi. It can be pronounced either way. If you Google it, you'll hear a couple different pronunciations. So we say either extensor digiti minimi or extensor digiti minimi. And the extensor, obviously, it's on the dorsal side. Its operation is extension. Digiti, meaning it's the digit. Minimi, the little digit. So quite literally, it's a muscle ending in an attachment or a tendon that is extending the little finger. It's got its own little private muscle dedicated to extending the little finger. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that around the knuckle, it's actually breaking in, we can see 2 tendons as it feeds over the knuckle there. So depending on the model you're looking at, if you can see closely enough and if the conditions are right, you'll not only see just one, you'll see 1 tendon running across, but it'll split a little and have 2 tendons running over the knuckle there, which is of course going to be different from our extensor digitorum communis, where it just is 1 tendon feeding over the knuckles on the first, middle, and ring finger. So that's our extensor digiti minimi. running down here, we have a group of two. The extensor pollicis brevis and extensor pollicis longus. So we've got two right here. When we extend our thumb, you'll see two prominent tendons. Got this guy here and this guy here. And the more pronounced you make them, the more extended the thumb will appear to the viewer. Now, which one is brevis and which one is longus? Well, brevis translates to short. Longus translates to long. It's quite simply referring to how long the muscle and related tendon is. Longer muscles tend to give us more leverage, more power and strength, whereas shorter muscles tend to be responsible for quicker motions. So often cases we'll see a brevis and a longus, one for quick movements, one for long, powerful movements. And the thumb has a lot of responsibilities in holding things with the hands and manipulating the hands. So we have two. We have a brief and a short and a long muscle for the thumb. Now, which is which? Well, the brevis is the one on bottom. It's a shorter muscle attaching very close to where we can see it, whereas the longus, the one on top, is attaching further up in the arm. So longus, extensor pollicis longus on top, extensor pollicis brevis on bottom. Last but not least, on the dorsal side, we're looking at something called the dorsal interosseous. Now, the interosseous is a muscle that's woven in between the fingers, helping with expansion and contraction of the fingers. We really see its bulk and prevalence just in one small section of the dorsal interosseous, and that is the padding and the bulk that's between the fingers here, the thumb and the first finger, when we have some contraction taking place here. So if somebody's hand is, if their thumb is closed towards their hand, we need to make sure we indicate some sort of bulk, some sort of roundness. When students don't indicate that and the hand is closed, the hand looks sort of flat and without dimension. So we need to make sure we indicate the bulk of the dorsal interosseous when the thumb is brought close to the body of the hand. Other than that, you're not going to need to know too much about the dorsal interosseous. It's not following, obviously, our extensor means, but the name dorsal should give you an indication that it is on the back side of the hand. All right, let's go ahead and move over to the palmar side of the hand. You'll notice again now we're seeing a lot of flexor. FLX is an abbreviation for flexor, so flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor pollicis brevis, lots of flexors. Flexors means that it's on the palm side of the hand. It's responsible for creating a flexing or inward curling motion for our wrist and our fingers. Using what we have talked about so far here on the dorsal side, we can begin to imagine what some of the functions and placements are for our muscles on the palmar side. First, flexor carpi radialis. Flexor should indicate that it's on the palmar side. Carpi indicates that it's responsible for flexing the wrist. Radialis should indicate that it's on the radius side of the wrist, so closer to the thumb side of the wrist. And so if we flex our hand, bring our wrist in this way, you'll notice in most cases two prominent muscles, two prominent tendons that are dissipating into the muscles of the flexor here. The tendon that is closest to the thumb is our flexor carpi radialis. So it is the flexor muscle flexing the wrist on the radius side of the wrist. The one next to it, the central one that you see here, is not in the entire population or entire species of humans. It is a muscle and tendon that is being phased out as unnecessary. Now it's called the palmaris longus here, and the palmaris longus was originally a gripping muscle. We used it when we needed strong gripping and holding power, so swinging from tree to tree, holding ourselves up, we required the palmaris longus. Over time, many thousands of years, it's becoming less and less necessary, and it's being phased out. So now it's in something, I can't recall, but something like 12% of the population. You may or may not have it. Now, if you don't have it, you're only going to see the one tendon, the flexor carpi radialis. So if you flex your wrist this way, and you only see one tendon here, well, then by reason it must be the flexor carpi radialis. If you see two, you'll have to keep in mind the one on the thumb side is the flexor carpi radialis. The one on the palm side, or I'm sorry, the central midline side is the palmaris longus. And really, with the flexing of the wrist, you'll only see one. It's with the addition of the flexing the palm turning inward, flexing in on itself, that you're going to see that palmaris longus really pop out. There we go. That's flexing the palm. Here's just flexing the wrist. Flexing the palm, flexing the wrist. So you may or may not see it, but it does add a nice amount of rigid line to the cylindrical nature of the wrist. So we'll keep an eye out for that palmaris longus. Underneath that, we have the flexor carpi ulnaris. Flexor, meaning it's on the palm side. Carpi, it's flexing the wrist. And ulnaris, it's going to be on the ulna side. So when we flex the wrist on just this little bit on the ulna side, we're going to see a tiny little tendon, in some cases prevalent on the ulna side here. So we'll see this band. You know, if we take a really dramatic superhero pose where we're really flexing everything, we're going to see, of course, the flexor carpi radialis, the palmaris longus, and then over here, crossing right in front of the pisiform is going to be the flexor carpi ulnaris. And in fact, I think one of the drawings that you do in the Bridgman book, he's got it broken down to where he's showing just that tendon of the flexor carpi ulnaris flowing over the pisiform. And so you can see how those are interconnected, and with a strong flexing motion, you will see that rigid tendon on the little finger side, palmar side of the wrist. So check for that flexor carpi ulnaris whenever the wrist is flexed. Beyond that, we're moving into the palm side of the hand now, and we're going to talk about a few muscles that are housed within the thumb side of the hand. And now the thumb is a very important muscle. It's giving us a lot of motion, a lot of ability to grip things. And in the art world, it breaks up the look of the hand so we can get more interesting motion, action, and dynamic nature in a hand than if it were just fingers. If it were just fingers, it would be more like the foot, more club-shaped. But because of the hand, or because of the thumb, we can get a lot of interesting, expressive action in the hand. So we'll look at a few muscles that are on the palmar side. It's in this group here. This group of muscles on the thumb side is, we actually have it listed down here. There's a name for it. It's called the thenar. The group is called the thenar. The thenar is referring to all these muscles here on the thumb side. And these muscles break down right here. We have the abductor, abducts the pollicis, flexor pollicis brevis, flex the pollicis, and adductor pollicis transversus, it adducts the pollicis. Well, okay, we know what flexor is. What about abduction or abductor and adduction or adductor? Well, what happens when you abduct something? You take it away. What happens when you adduct something? You add it. So abduction means that it's a muscle responsible for taking the thumb away. Adduction, or adductor pollicis transversus, means it's responsible for adding the thumb. Well, taking it away and adding it to what? That's the question, and the answer is the palm. Abductor pollicis, it's actually located on this side of the thumb, or this side of the thenar. When it tugs, the thumb comes away from the palm of the hand. The adductor pollicis transversus is a muscle up here, and it stretches across the palm here. And when that tightens, the thumb is added to the hand. So we have abduction, muscle over here, adduction, muscle over here, pulling. Abduct, adduct. Flexor pollicis brevis, a flexing muscle of the thumb, that's a short muscle, is responsible for flexing. Flexing, remember, is curling inward. So this would be a flexing motion. So if this is the flexing motion, then it would stand to reason that the flexor is pollicis brevis is right here. So when this tugs, our thumb flexes inward. So we have abduction, abducts away. Adduction, adds towards the hand. And flexion, flexes. So abductor pollicis on the outside, adductor pollicis transversus on the inside, and flexor pollicis brevis in the middle of the two. That'll cover everything in the thenar. You'll notice down here we have a group called the hypothenar. The hypothenar is going to be everything that's contained in this side, the opposite side of the hand here. And you'll notice the hand has a good amount of topography. The thenar has a nice curvature to it, and then the hypothenar has another curvature to it, a little more subtle, but still prominent. So we need to make sure that the thenar and the hypothenar represent that the hand itself has this sort of cup-like motion. The thenar and the hypothenar, and then the finger pads up here, are creating this cup-like motion of the hand. The hand is not flat. We should never draw the hand as flat. So make sure you give a proper definition and form to your thenar and your hypothenar. One last little muscle to indicate is the abductor digiti minimi. Now, we should understand what that is and about where it should be placed just by its name. Abductor, it takes away. Digiti minimi takes away the little finger. So if there is a muscle on the hand that is responsible for taking the little finger away from the other little fingers, it would stand to reason that it's going to be located on the outside here of the hypothenar. And so when you extend, or when you pull away, when you abduct your little pinky, you'll notice a bulging, firm muscle right on the outside of the hypothenar. That's the abductor digiti minimi. So it tenses here and it pulls the little finger away from the hand. So when we operate our abductor digiti minimi and our abductor pollicis, we pull our fingers far, far apart. So beyond this somewhat comprehensive list of bones and muscles and tendons in the hand that we have looked at today, we're going to discuss a few little factoids that'll help keep your drawing in check and believable. And a lot of this is information that's nestled in the text of Vanderpool. If you get a chance, I recommend you read it. It's a little dry. He does have a tendency to produce long, run-on sentences. However, there's a lot of valuable information contained in there. So, for example, when we talked about the chest, how the false ribs are the furthest projecting point on the torso, that's nestled within one of the paragraphs of the Vanderpool text. So we'll just discuss a few of those factoids here today. For example, the wrist. There is a limited amount of motion that the wrist can do without appearing to be broken or have some opposing or outside force acting upon it. For example, the amount of bending a wrist can do forward should be about 90 degrees. Backwards, also 90 degrees. If you describe a wrist bent more than 90 degrees, it will look like either A, the wrist is broken, or B, the wrist is supporting some force or leaning against the wall in some way to create that additional bending. So you need to make sure that there's just cause for that bending. Left to right, we're dealing with an amount of about 45 degrees. Anything more than 45 degrees, you'd have to swing your elbow inward. So you have to make sure there's no 90-degree bend at the wrist, left or right. So 90 degrees forward, 90 degrees back, 45 degrees left, 45 degrees right. The thickness of a wrist, proportional to its the depth to the width, is going to be something that's important. And as a proportion, maintains a standard relatively strongly across most people. And that's going to be a width of 2 to a height or depth of 1. So it should be 1 thickness here compared to 2 here. 1 to 2. Anything outside of that, the wrist will start to look a little too sausagey or too perfectly round and unbelievable. Keep in mind there's, in most people, not a huge amount of fat deposit. And even if there is fat deposit, it's going to be built on proportionally at the wrist to each other. So it should still, regardless of the person's size, be relatively a 2 to 1 ratio. Another thing that we should mention is when making a fist. Often if you're going to do anything as far as comic book animation work, or even dynamic poses, or for example, when we do an extended pose and we have somebody gripping a pole, we're going to have to come to grips with how to draw a wrist and the arrangement of knuckles, the protrusion of knuckles. Keep in mind, knuckles are not even straight across because there is some curvature in the hand. And in fact, the knuckle of your middle finger is the furthest projecting forward. So that when you punch, the middle finger, middle knuckle, lines up directly with the radius and creates a direct battering ram so that you don't shatter your arm. If the first finger, for example, was the furthest projecting and you punched with the first finger, the shock would not be distributed evenly towards the middle of the radius, and thus you could shatter or splinter your hand, or very least sprain it. So we need to render this knuckle, middle knuckle, as the most protruding forward. Draw a wrist or a fist this way. The knuckle should be first. Now there might be some variation between whether or not the first finger or the ring finger ends up being in front. It can change from person to person, but the middle finger should have the knuckle extending forward the most. Another thing to consider is the shape of the hand itself. We talked about how the thenar and the hypothenar create some curvature in the hand. So if we were to look at our hand this way, take a cross section of it, we would see the thenar on this side, or I'm sorry, the hypothenar over here with this gentle sloping, and then the thenar over here with its more dramatic angle. And then, the fingers extending beyond. Thumb over here. So this is the orientation that we would see the palm of the hand, and then the back of the hand too is going to have some form to it. And we'll see it as a more rapid roundness here on the thumb side, and then a gentle sloping towards the little finger side. So look at the back of your hand. Notice how it's got this gentle curvature towards the pinky side, and it's more round on the thumb side. So if we were to flip it around and take a cross section now of the, looking at the top of our hand like this, we would see the thumb side sloping into the pinky side. And this is the back of our hand. We have to have this curvature. If we don't have this curvature, then our hand will look either like a flat block or like some sort of weird sausage, or as in the case of most studio or students or amateur enthusiasts, we get hands that look like oven mitts, just these big, bulky, fluffy, round hands. We need to have a lot of this angularity and the subtle attention paid to the shape and the form that's taking place in the hand. So keep that in mind. One final point to mention, something that's listed in Bridgman actually, and you're going to do a drawing on, has to do with the finger joint and the pad alignments. This is something we see in Open Studio quite frequently. A finger that's drawn this way. that is not an appropriate finger. We have to pay special attention to how the pads on the bottom line up to the joints on the top. They are not equal. And if you draw them equal, you'll get these strange sausage link fingers. So instead we have to pay attention to the alignment. Now you do have this advantage of having a hand of your own, and this hand has joints and pads. So if you're ever at a doubt, look at your own hand to see the alignment. It'll start the same. For your first finger here, you're going to have 3 segments. These being the knuckles, and this being the hand over here. Now keep in mind that it's going to be always more angular on the dorsal side and a little more rounded at the bottom side. So for this first one, the pad is going to be set a little back from the knuckle. The second one is lined up more or less right on. And the third one is going to be set in front of the knuckle. So if we were to draw these dotted lines, we would see the alignment this way. The knuckle is placed distal to the pad joint. The knuckle is placed directly above the pad joint. The knuckle is proximal to the pad joint. The middle finger could be a little different. Perhaps, and this will also vary a little bit by some people, but we could have more or less equal alignments. But this first finger is going to be relatively consistent among most people. So pay attention to your pad alignments. When the hand is closed, we're going to see something slightly different. We're going to see an additional pad pop up, which is the result of this here. We have the skin and the pad that's right here. And when we make a fist, you'll notice it creates this additional little pad. So we see something along the lines of this. We'll see a pad, a pad, a pad, and a pad. 4 pads. You will have to do this on your test. You'll have to demonstrate to me. I think the question is something like, do a drawing of a finger with both open hand and as a fist, showing the pad and joint alignments. And if all else fails, I will again encourage you to just look at your own hand. That should provide the answers that you seek. The one last tidbit of information that I want to make sure I throw out there before we send you off for today is the length of these segments here. Now, it's not going to be exactly lined up, but it's going to be close to this. That the 2 distal segments are about the length combined as the first segment is. So it should look in each of your fingers like this segment is half of the length of the finger, and these equal the remaining half of the finger. If you make each of the segments an equal length, your finger will look a little strange. So that's about it for our little factoids. Keep these in mind as well as study your muscles, and we will have the midterm next week.